December 1941. The sky over the Pacific is wide and deceptively calm. Morning light glints off aluminum wings as engines cut through the air with a steady mechanical rhythm. Below, the ocean stretches endlessly, blue and indifferent. In Tokyo, maps are being unfolded. Pins are placed with confidence. Reports from China and earlier clashes suggest a simple truth: American pilots are poorly trained, overly cautious, bound by rigid doctrine. Industrial workers, not warriors. That belief settles deep inside the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. Thousands of miles away, on airfields in Hawaii and the continental United States, young men climb into cockpits smelling of oil, leather, and fresh paint. Some are barely out of training. Others are veterans of long ferry flights and endless gunnery drills. None of them know how they are being judged by the enemy they have not yet fully met. When the first shots are fired in the sky, expectations collide with reality. What begins as mockery will soon harden into calculation, and calculation will give way to something far more dangerous: respect born from loss. Because wars are not only fought with machines and bullets. They are fought with assumptions. And in the air war over the Pacific, those assumptions are about to be tested. To understand why Japan first underestimated, then feared, and finally respected American pilots, we must begin with the world that shaped those beliefs. The world before the encounter. By the late 1930s, Imperial Japan stood at war long before the United States ever entered the conflict. Since 1937, Japanese forces had been fighting continuously in China, where air power played a central psychological and tactical role. Japanese pilots dominated the skies over cities like Shanghai, Nanjing, and Wuhan. Against Chinese aircraft, often outdated, poorly maintained, and flown by pilots with limited training, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Services built a reputation for speed, precision, and aggression. This experience shaped not only Japanese tactics, but Japanese confidence. Japanese fighter doctrine emphasized maneuverability, individual skill, and offensive spirit. The Matsubashi A6M0, introduced in 1940, embodied this philosophy. Lightweight, long-ranged, and exceptionally agile, it could outturn nearly every fighter it faced in the early years of the war. Its pilots were elite by design. Training was long, selective, and unforgiving. Only a fraction of candidates survived the process, and those who did accumulated hundreds of flight hours, far more than most of their foreign counterparts at the time. Across the Pacific, the American approach looked very different. The United States in the late 1930s was not yet a nation at war. Its air forces, the U.S. Army Air Corps and the U.S. Navy's aviation arm, were expanding, but cautiously. Budgets fluctuated. Aircraft development was ongoing, but doctrine lagged behind ambition. Many American pilots trained in peacetime conditions, with strict safety regulations and limited exposure to combat-style flying. Japanese intelligence officers observed this carefully. Reports from attachés, translated articles, and pro-war military studies painted American pilots as technically competent but spiritually soft. The Japanese concept of sushin, fighting spirit, was believed to be lacking in Western Uman. Americans, Japanese planners believed, relied on machines and numbers rather than courage and individual skill. They expected U.S. pilots to avoid close combat, brake under pressure, and fight defensively. These beliefs were reinforced by racial and cultural prejudice. Japanese military ideology emphasized discipline, sacrifice, and obedience to the emperor. American society, viewed from Tokyo, appeared individualistic, materialistic, and unprepared for the hardships of sustained war. Pilots who came from civilian life were assumed to lack the mental resilience required for aerial combat. By 1941, these assumptions hardened into doctrine. When Japan prepared for war against the United States, its planners believed they would face an opponent slow to react, slow to adapt, and slow to learn. In the opening months, Japanese pilots expected to dominate the air just as they had over China. But this confidence rested on a narrow view of their enemy. They had studied American machines. They had underestimated American people. And that miscalculation would only become visible once combat erased theory and replaced it with experience. That experience began the moment Japanese pilots first encountered American UMAN in combat, and the shock that followed reshaped everything. First encounters and early judgments. The first true test of Japanese assumptions came not over Tokyo or Washington, but in the chaotic skies above the Pacific in December 1941. Pearl Harbor was not an air battle in the traditional sense, but it Ruveludzeled exposed the first cracks in perception. A handful of American pilots managed to get airborne during the attack. Flying outdated P-40 Wahawks and P-36 Hawks, they fought at a severe disadvantage, outnumbered, surprised, and facing veteran Japanese aviators. Yet even in those first moments, something unexpected emerged. American pilots did not flee. Despite confusion and lack of coordination, U.S. UMAN engaged aggressively when given the chance. They attacked head-on, used diving speed, and pressed their limited ammunition into close-range firing passes. Japanese after-action reports from Pearl Harbor noted resistance that was stronger than anticipated, even if ultimately ineffective in stopping the raid. The pattern repeated itself across the Pacific in the weeks that followed. Over the Philippines, American and Filipino pilots flew against overwhelming odds. Aircraft were often destroyed on the ground. Fuel and spare parts were scarce. Command structures were fractured. Still, U.S. pilots continued to challenge Japanese formations. In air battles over Luzon, Japanese pilots began to notice that American flyers preferred high-speed slashing attacks rather than turning dogfights, a tactical choice born of necessity, but one that preserved both aircraft and pilot. To Japanese veterans trained to value tight turns and close engagement, this style initially appeared clumsy. They labeled American pilots as mockery, dependent on engine power and straight-line speed. Many believed these tactics reflected fear rather than calculation. But numbers told a different story. Losses among Japanese aircraft, though acceptable by early war standards, were higher than predicted. More importantly, Japanese pilots began encountering Americans who learned rapidly. Survivors of one engagement returned with modified tactics for the next. Gunnery improved. Formation discipline tightened. Radio coordination, something Japanese aviation often neglected, proved increasingly effective. By early 1942, intelligence summaries began shifting in tone. Where earlier reports dismissed American pilots as amateurs, newer assessments described them as stubborn, methodical, and increasingly dangerous. The Americans did not possess the individual finesse of Japan's elite aces, but they compensated with teamwork and adaptability. This unsettled Japanese Air Command. They had prepared for a short war, one decisive blow followed by negotiated peace. Instead, they were facing an opponent who absorbed losses, studied failure, and returned stronger. Mockery still existed. Confidence remained high. But beneath it, a quiet recognition was forming. The enemy in the sky was not who Japan thought he was. And as the war expanded, those early impressions would be tested again and again through technology, leadership, and the brutal arithmetic of attrition. Japanese pilots entered the war with a clear image of themselves. They were professionals, shaped by years of selection and sacrifice. Many had flown combat missions over China before the Pacific War began. They believed this experience separated them from Western pilots who, in their view, had been shielded by peacetime training and comfort. When they first met American pilots, Japanese aviators searched for signs of hesitation. They expected panic in the cockpit, sloppy maneuvers, early break-offs. Instead, they found something harder to categorize. American pilots were not uniform. Some were inexperienced, and it showed. Others displayed an aggressive confidence that surprised their opponents. Japanese pilots noted that American airmen often pressed attacks even after losing positional advantage. They absorbed damage and continued flying. They refused to disengage when doctrine suggested retreat. Post-war Japanese memoirs would later reflect this contradiction. American pilots lacked the polished elegance of Japanese aerobatic skill, but they displayed a stubborn determination that defied expectation. This was not the romanticized courage of Japanese Bushido culture, but something more pragmatic, focused on survival, mission completion, and mutual protection. It was unsettling. Japanese pilots fought as individuals within formations. American pilots increasingly fought as teams. When one aircraft was threatened, others intervened without hesitation. This collective behavior began to erode the Japanese assumption that American pilots lacked fighting spirit. They did not fight beautifully, but they fought relentlessly. And that realization forced Japanese aviators to reconsider what courage looked like in the modern air war. Japanese air doctrine prized close combat. Turning fights were a measure of skill and honor. Victory was personal, visible, and decisive. Against early American aircraft, Japanese pilots often succeeded by drawing enemies into horizontal turns where the zero reigned supreme. But American pilots learned quickly. They stopped turning, they used altitude, they relied on diving speed and firepower. Boom and zoom tactics denied Japanese pilots the kind of engagement they preferred. To Japanese observers, this initially appeared evasive, even cowardly. Yet results mattered. American pilots survived, they scored kills, and they returned to fight again. Japanese after-action reports began to describe American tactics as calculating rather than fearful. This shift in language was subtle but important. It signaled respect for effectiveness over form. What mattered was not how one fought, but whether one endured. By mid-1942, Japanese pilots understood that American flyers were not bound by tradition. They adapted their methods without emotional attachment to doctrine. That flexibility would prove decisive in a war defined by change. Still, human behavior and tactics were only part of the story. Machines and leadership would further reshape Japanese perceptions in ways they could not ignore. Early in the war, Japanese pilots believed American aircraft were inferior, heavier, less agile, poor substitutes for skill. On paper, this assessment was not entirely wrong. The Zero could outturn nearly every U.S. fighter it encountered in 1941 and early 1942. Japanese pilots exploited this advantage mercilessly. But American aircraft were built with a different philosophy. They were rugged, armored, designed to bring pilots home. Japanese pilots began noticing that American fighters absorbed damage that would have destroyed a Zero. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fires. Armor plating saved lives. Even when hit, American planes often escaped. This frustrated Japanese aviators trained to expect decisive outcomes. Shots that should have killed did not. Enemies returned. Some even reappeared days later in different aircraft. The machine was changing the meaning of survival. As newer American aircraft arrived, the F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, later the P-38 Lightning, Japanese pilots encountered machines that matched or exceeded their own in speed, firepower, and climb. Combined with increasing American numbers, technology erased Japan's early advantages. By 1943, Japanese pilots no longer dismissed American aircraft as crude. They feared them. Japanese pilot training was elite but fragile. Losses could not be replaced quickly. Veteran pilots were irreplaceable, and when they died, experience vanished with them. American training was industrial. Pilots were produced in large numbers, trained systematically, and rotated through units with standardized doctrine. Japanese intelligence initially mocked this factory approach, but as veteran Japanese aces were lost, American squadrons grew more experienced with each month of fighting. Leadership amplified this effect. American commanders encouraged innovation. Tactical lessons were shared widely. Failures were analyzed without shame. Japanese leadership, constrained by hierarchy and tradition, adapted more slowly. By late 1943, Japanese pilots were increasingly facing Americans who were not only better equipped, but better led. And for the first time, respect began to outweigh contempt. Perhaps the most important shift occurred internally. Japanese pilots stopped asking whether American pilots were brave. They began asking how best to survive against them. That question marked the end of mockery. The war in the air had become something else entirely. And that transformation would reach its breaking point in a series of battles where perception gave way to undeniable reality. The Battle of Midway and the air war that redefined respect. June 4, 1942, the Pacific dawn breaks over the Midway Atoll. Coral atolls glint in the early light, surrounded by endless blue. The Japanese fleet moves with precision, carriers poised to strike, confident in their dominance. Above them, Mitsubishi Zeros streak through the sky, ready to sweep aside any opposition. The Imperial Japanese Navy's intelligence had convinced itself that the American carriers would be caught unprepared. American pilots would scatter, aircraft would be destroyed on the ground, resistance would be minimal. But the Americans had learned the lessons Japan had underestimated. Dive bombers from USS Enterprise, Hornet and Yorktown found the Japanese carriers exposed, waiting. B-17s and torpedo bombers had already attempted attacks, drawing Zeros into altitude battles. American pilots were not perfect. They suffered heavy losses, but they displayed discipline, persistence, and courage that surprised Japanese observers. Japanese after-action reports recorded astonishment. Pilots who had anticipated panic and retreat were instead confronted with methodical, aggressive assaults. The U.S. Navy's aviators attacked with relentless focus, exploiting weaknesses in Japanese formation and timing with deadly precision. The battle's early hours revealed a brutal calculus. Several Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, were hit by bombs dropped by dive bombers operating far above the levels where Japanese pilots felt comfortable. Zeros could chase some attackers, but others slipped through. Japanese pilots realized that American airmen could adapt tactics mid-combat, anticipate maneuvers, and survive where they had expected easy kills. For many Japanese aviators, this was the first undeniable proof that American pilots were not merely lucky or reckless. They were resilient, adaptable, and deadly. This confrontation shattered initial assumptions. Mockery of the American foe could no longer survive factual scrutiny. Fear, grudging respect, and caution began to define Japanese engagements for the rest of the war. And yet Midway was only the beginning. The real test of American airmen and the full measure of Japanese reassessment would come over Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and the skies above the Pacific Theater's most desperate battles. Guadalcanal and the hard lesson of attrition. August 1942. Guadalcanal, a narrow, humid strip of land in the Solomons, becomes the new stage for the Pacific Air War. Henderson Field, hastily constructed by the Americans, projects influence across the surrounding islands and sea. Its defenders are few, their aircraft limited, yet they hold a strategic choke point that Japan cannot ignore. Japanese pilots approach with confidence, recalling victories over China and the early raids on Pearl Harbor. They expect to overwhelm a disorganized enemy, yet the Americans have learned the value of endurance. Warhawks, though outclassed in maneuverability, fly repeatedly, striking, retreating, and returning to fight again. Rotations, maintenance, and improvisation keep the airfield operational despite constant Japanese bombardment. Dogfights erupt daily. Zeros dive, twist, and climb, pursuing targets as they always have. But American pilots now use boom and zoom tactics with precision. They attack from altitude, strike hard, then climb back to avoid the deadly turn-based fighting the Japanese favor. Each engagement leaves a trail of destruction, but the pattern is clear. Americans survive, regroup, and attack again. Japanese veterans begin to recognize a terrifying reality. The human and mechanical resilience of these pilots is extraordinary. A single squadron of Americans can inflict disproportionate damage and reappear hours later, ready to fight under conditions that would have demoralized other foes. Losses that Japan assumes will break the enemy instead serve to harden their tactics. Morale and perception shift. Mockery gives way to calculation. Calculation gives way to respect. Imperial pilots admit in diaries and post-war memoirs that these Americans are stubborn, relentless, and surprisingly clever. They are not aesthetically perfect in combat as the Japanese measure skill, but their results are undeniable. The air battles over Guadalcanal illustrate a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Adaptability, persistence, and tactical innovation can surpass raw technical skill and traditional bravado. By 1943, Japanese pilots no longer saw Americans as inexperienced or weak. They were a force that demanded both fear and respect. This transformation in Japanese perception did not stop at individual pilots. It extended to fleet commanders, strategy, and the broader understanding of what the Pacific War would require: endurance, industrial strength, and tactical evolution. The stage was set. Respect for American airmen was no longer theoretical, it was operational, and it would define the next phase of the war in the Pacific. Consequences in the sky and on the ground. By late 1943, the transformation in Japanese perceptions of American pilots had become unmistakable. What began as contempt had evolved into a careful calculation, born from repeated encounters over Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomons. Japanese pilots, once convinced of their dominance, now faced a foe who combined tactical innovation, resilience, and an industrial backing that guaranteed replacements, both men and machines. Casualty reports from the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service reveal the human cost of these engagements. Veteran pilots, irreplaceable by Japanese standards, were lost at alarming rates. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, for example, saw dozens of experienced aviators shot down or killed. Their deaths carried strategic consequences. Each loss weakened the collective skill pool, disrupted formation discipline, and forced younger, less trained pilots into the crucible of combat sooner than planned. Meanwhile, American losses, though significant, were absorbed in a manner Japan struggled to replicate. U.S. pilot training programs, expanded massively after Pearl Harbor, continually produced replacements. Industrial production ensured a steady supply of aircraft capable of standing up to or surpassing Japanese machines. The resilience of both technology and personnel created a persistent pressure point, forcing Japanese forces to engage in battles they could neither dominate nor easily avoid. The psychological impact was equally profound. Japanese pilots, once confident in their superiority, began approaching missions with caution. Pre-war assumptions of innate skill and spiritual advantage were replaced by tactical assessments of enemy capability. Engagements that previously would have been taken aggressively were now scrutinized, measured, and often avoided if unnecessary. Respect for American pilots had seeped into doctrine itself, shaping decisions at every level. This shift was documented in numerous after-action reports and personal memoirs. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most celebrated aces, later reflected on encounters with American pilots over Guadalcanal. They fought with a stubbornness we could not understand. Not all were skilled, but they did not falter. That was frightening and admirable. The combination of mounting losses, strategic recalibration, and acknowledgement of American effectiveness forced the Japanese Navy to reconsider its approach to air warfare. Mockery was gone. Fear, tempered by respect, now governed engagement strategies. The trajectory of the war had changed. The Pacific skies would no longer be a playground for assumptions. They had become a proving ground of skill, persistence, and adaptation. Strategic and cultural shifts in the Imperial Air Force. By early 1944, the cumulative effect of repeated air engagements had reshaped Japanese air strategy and cultural perception of their enemy. The initial arrogance of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, born from victories in China and early Pacific operations, had eroded. Commanders and pilots alike had learned that American airmen were not to be underestimated. Reports now described U.S. pilots as tenacious, adaptive, and relentless, words previously reserved for elite Japanese aces. Operational tactics shifted as well. Japanese pilots began flying in tighter formations, emphasizing defensive cohesion rather than the individualistic maneuvers that had defined early victories. Escort strategies were improved, reconnaissance became more cautious, and attacks were planned with greater attention to American adaptability. The Japanese command recognized that underestimating U.S. forces could no longer be risked. Every sortie carried a lesson, every loss a warning. The human element became central. Pilots were increasingly aware that American resilience derived not only from training, but also from industrial capacity and numerical superiority. Even the most skilled Japanese pilot could be overwhelmed by attrition. This realization fueled a grudging respect that transcended personal ego and highlighted the systemic advantages of the American war machine. Cultural shifts followed. Memoirs and post-war interviews reveal a transformation in language and mindset. Japanese pilots, once proud of their spiritual and martial superiority, spoke of American pilots with reverence, acknowledging courage, ingenuity, and adaptability. Veteran aces, such as Hiroyoshi Nishizawa and Saburo Sakai, admitted that facing American airmen required constant recalibration, mental discipline, and humility. On the strategic level, these lessons influenced the course of the Pacific War. Japanese planners became increasingly aware that air superiority was no longer guaranteed. Carrier-based operations, once the cornerstone of Japanese offensive power, faced escalating risks. The attrition of experienced pilots weakened the execution of complex maneuvers, while American resilience and tactical evolution steadily shifted the balance of air power. The transformation was clear. Initial mockery of the American Air Force had evolved into fear and ultimately into respect. Japanese pilots, while still valorous and skillful, now faced an opponent whose effectiveness could not be ignored. The Pacific Theater's air battles had not only tested machines and tactics, they had reshaped perception itself, defining the psychological landscape for both sides in ways that would resonate until the war's final days. This recognition of American skill, persistence, and adaptability set the stage for reflection on what these encounters meant for history, human endurance, and the evolution of modern aerial warfare. The legacy of fear, respect, and adaptation. The story of Japanese perceptions of American pilots is not merely a tale of planes in the sky. It is a narrative about assumptions, adaptation, and the unpredictable consequences of underestimating one's opponent. Early in the Pacific War, Japanese airmen believed in their innate superiority, molded by rigorous training, combat experience, and a culture that glorified courage and precision. They mocked what they considered inexperienced, overcautious Americans. But reality proved more complex. Across Midway, Guadalcanal, and countless Pacific skies, American pilots displayed a resilience that defied expectation. They fought not with elegance, but with persistence. They compensated for technological or numerical disadvantages through adaptability, teamwork, and a willingness to learn. To Japanese eyes, this created a paradox. These pilots lacked the traditional hallmarks of mastery, yet achieved results that could not be ignored. This evolution from mockery to fear, and finally to respect, illustrates a universal principle of warfare. Success is not only measured by skill or tradition, but by the ability to endure, innovate, and adapt under pressure. Machines can kill, tactics can dictate outcomes, but the human element, the mindset, courage, and flexibility of individuals and collectives ultimately shapes the course of history. The Pacific Air War, viewed through the lens of Japanese perception, also reveals the profound psychological dimension of conflict. Respect for the enemy arises not from ideology or politics, but from observation, experience, and consequence. Japanese pilots, grudging acknowledgement of American capability, highlights the human tendency to learn from reality when confronted with repeated failure or surprise. In the end, these encounters left a lasting mark on military thinking and cultural memory. The legend of the American pilot, feared, mocked, and eventually respected, stands as a testament to adaptability, persistence, and the enduring impact of human determination. In the vast skies over the Pacific, history was written not just in victories or losses, but in the recognition of the opponent's strength, and in the humility that acknowledgement demands. In understanding these transformations, we glimpse a truth far beyond the war itself. That respect born from confrontation, not assumption, shapes the human story in ways that echo across generations.